We're living in exciting times, folks, that's for sure. Everything is changing and we can all feel it. We can definitely see it, but we feel like there's a lot more coming. Like what we're experiencing is maybe the beginning of something that will culminate with a drastic movement or an event or whatever. I think we all kind of feel that. And I don't know what to necessarily make of that. I'm a Christian, and so I always in the back of my head is, is this the end? Are we getting closer to the end? There's lots of signs, lots of weird things happening. There's lots of stuff coming out that would not be considered normal like 10, 20 years ago or whatnot. Of course, now they're talking about aliens openly. We just learned with the Jeffrey Epstein files. Well, we just confirmed that basically there's a shadow world government, has more power than the authorities that we're told had, power over law enforcement activities, over the government, stuff like that. So there's a lot happening. And if you're like me and you're a news hound and you're interested in what's happening from a purely I don't know, analytical perspective, or as a spectator to God's play on earth, then you kind of look at it more with interest than maybe fear or anxiety or whatnot. I know a lot of people are anxious, and so I don't know what to tell you other than the fact that things are going to play out the way they're going to play out. We have a small role to play. But I was just thinking, I came from an event recently, or I went to an event recently here in Kentucky, and it was a launch party, a headquarters launch party for Thomas Massie, who, as you guys probably picked up, I'm a big fan of. I think he's a really good congressman, that's for sure. I think he's principled, and I think he's actually a decent person, which is rare. And I was thinking as I was in that crowd, and I was with my wife, and me and her coincidentally have been together since right around the time that Trump started to come up on the scene. So now I'm looking at this frame here, this 10, 12-year frame, and it's fascinating to see how far we've come along, or how we've come along, and how this whole thing has evolved. And I think most people would say that even 3 years ago, we wouldn't have imagined that we are where we are today. But I kind of want to rewind to, 10, 12 years ago. And that's when I entered journalism. I took a job at a small town newspaper in Montana. I was living in Atlanta, and it was the only place that would hire me. I had applied to a lot of places. I didn't have a journalism degree. I wasn't going to get one just to get the same entry level job that I would get with a journalism degree. I did fool somebody into hiring me. It turned out to be one of the best moves of my life. 1 year before I ever hit my 1 year mark into journalism, I ended up, winning for investigative reporting and things like that. So I kind of liked it. I was good at it, and there's a reason for that. And I think part of that is because I'm generally interested in what's happening and sharing it with people. Anyway, so in this newsroom, which again is in Montana, and this is right there up there on the High Line. It's not the Montana you see in a river runs through or anything. It's a different Montana, but it's a beautiful Montana. I will always have fond memories of it. But anyway, I was the only person who actually liked Trump in the newsroom. Even like I said, even in a place that is pretty conservative over there, although they do have a heavy Democrat uh, presence due to the unions and whatnot. But anyway, I remember what that was like when Trump was coming up and he was, demolishing all these other candidates in the GOP primary. He was unfiltered. He was ticking off everyone all the time by everything he was saying. He broke all the rules. He moved the Overton window. He said things that people had been thinking about for a long time, especially when it comes to immigration. Immigration is still huge, and I think that's one of the last things he's still delivering on. And then I ended up going to Trump rallies. I covered two or three, I believe, in Montana, one in Great Falls, one in Billings, and maybe another one in Great Falls. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if he went to it twice. But anyway, he was stumping. He was stumping for someone there. I totally forget who was. He was stumping against John Tester, actually, who has been ousted. So anyway, it was a huge turnout. It was like I have I have a newspaper from the Great Falls Tribune here, and it says Trump mania hits Great Falls. And I attended that, and I attended it as a reporter for my news site at the time. And it was electrifying. It was an amazing atmosphere. It was also a little aggressive, and to my wife, a little even scary because Trump was able to manipulate the crowd into booing the press louder and louder. He kept churning, like, feeding the anger into them, and then they would boo and churn and look at us. We were all in the press box, like meaner, and they'd boo us louder. And she thought that was kind of scary. And there was another reporter next to me, and he said something to he made a reference to, like, I don't know, like Nazi, like Führer style control over the masses and whatnot. And so that was common among reporters, but there were also reporters there who liked him. They even had like "Make America Great" hats, you know. And so the few events, the rallies that I attended, it was a crazy atmosphere. It was an exciting atmosphere. And then a couple of years ago, I went to a CPAC event out in Washington and whatnot. And once again, it was, this was just before he got reelected. The environment, the atmosphere was electrifying. There was hope. There was there was a feeling that things were going to change. And it was a good feeling. It was You could tell that people were hopeful. And then, when Trump did show up, I mean, he does that thing where he never appears when he's supposed to. They'll go through a song list for like an hour. And every time a new song comes on, people think that maybe he'll come on stage or whatever, and they'll start putting up their phones and whatnot. It's really exciting stuff to be at one of those. And you can always tell that you're part of history, that something special is happening. I remember at CPAC, I was sitting next to a reporter whose newspaper was based like in like Sweden or Norway or something. I don't know. But anyway, she was one of those reporters who basically followed Trump around all the time. And there was lots of those. You had the Times there, Washington Post, everyone's there, Reuters, AP, whatnot. And so she said something along the lines like, "This is unique. He's not your typical politician." She had been covering politicians, US presidents, everything for a long time. She says, this is not normal. This is not Something is happening here. We all sense that. But then, of course, he got reelected. And I think within months, it started becoming apparent that Trump was not as different as we wanted him to be. And maybe it's because we had higher expectations. But there were at least a few things that he did, which is basically um, against the promises, completely contrary to the promises that he made. The two things I think of immediately are his positions on war. He's suddenly become this like uh, very like bellicose, aggressive leader who just wants to go around everywhere and turning over regimes and attacking and whatnot. And that wasn't what people voted for. It's not at all even close to what he promised. In fact, he kept saying no new wars because he did a pretty decent job in the first time around of not getting into any new wars. But now, he's already bombed Iran. You had that incident in Venezuela, and I'm no fan of Maduro. I'm no fan of communism for sure and whatnot. But I just don't see how that could be setting a good precedent, because basically what it says is that if you're strong enough, you can do whatever you want. You can go nab the leaders of whoever you want, and no one can do anything because you're the strongest. And that might makes right approach. And in a way, we were supposed to be above that. I'm not saying we were always above that or fully above that. I don't think that's ever been the case, but I think this was so blatant. And I think it sets a dangerous precedent. I wish there was some other way to do that. Anyway, so that happened. The whole Iran thing happened. He just basically unilaterally ordered the military to go bomb those nuclear sites. And now it looks like we're about to do it again. And, whereas Venezuela is at least in our hemisphere and maybe a pseudo Monroe Doctrine-esque argument could be made for that. I think when it comes to Iran, there's no argument that could be made for it. Iran hasn't attacked us. I know some people say, well, they attacked us by proxy. I think the Lebanon, what was it? quite a few number of Marines or whatever, and that's sad. But you know what? The reason that happened is because we built an empire and we put people in harm's way everywhere. And then we use that as an excuse to engage in war. It's absolute insanity. It's batshit crazy that they're allowed to get away with this. We'll put bases. You know, we have over like 700 installations, military style installations of some sort around the world. No one's even come close. No one even comes close. Not Russia, not China, no one to this kind of imperialism. And that's the thing. I mean, we never came out and said it, but clearly we're an empire. But the unfortunate thing about that is that the people were never asked. And I would think that most Americans would not want to be an empire. But also, I'm starting to learn that maybe more Americans than I realized have been fooled into accepting positions and ideas that go against their interest. You know, those there's more Americans I think who are fine with attacking Iran than I would like to be, and I think it's because they believe that Iran poses a threat to America. I don't think that's even close to true. I think it's crazy that we get to think that we're the arbiters of truth and the judges, and we get to tell who can have a civilian nuclear program and who can't, who can have nuclear weapons, who can't. You know, it just doesn't. I don't think it's about that. I think there's more at stake there, and it's something else. So anyway, you have all this going on, and these were things that Trump didn't say he was going to do, because I think they wouldn't have gone well. I think people have been like, what? No, no, we don't want anything to do with that. And then of course there's the Epstein thing that really backfired on him, because um, it turned out that he didn't mean it when he said that he would call for the release of the Epstein files. And so I wanted to kind of recap, because now we're at a point where an anti-Trump, what I consider MAGA figure, has emerged, and that in Thomas Massie, and he's not alone. Also, you know, Rand Paul has been in Congress for a long time. They have the same values. They have Rand Paul has opposed a lot of the president's policies based on principle for a long time. There's a crop of other guys, but they're not as they haven't stood up to the president in the way that Massie has. And Massie has, he's attracted a lot of arrows from the president, and it looks like he's the emerging leader of another movement. And I would call this movement Americanism. And it's not my term. It's a term that was invented or coined by Robert Welch, who started the John Birch Society. And Americanism is, if you had to choose a synonym for it, it's just constitutionalism. That's all it is, and it's just the belief that that governments, state and federal governments, should operate according to the prescriptions of the founders and within the limitations of the Constitution. And that's not even close to happening. I mentioned Iran, the fact that the president can just order an act of war against another country without any permission from Congress. That's completely contrary to the US Constitution. It's completely contrary to the way that the framers created the United States government and the president to operate. There was I think it is a Federalist 69 where the writer says that the position of the presidency is has inferior powers to that of the king. And it absolutely states right there, unequivocally, that the president cannot willy-nilly, unilaterally order war actions. Obviously, it is a war action to bomb another country. Obviously, it is a war action to go into another country, kill the head of state's bodyguards, nab the head of state after bombing the area and whatnot, and coming back home, because we know it's an act of war. We would consider that an act of war. Someone came and did the same thing, got President Trump and flew away. It's crazy. And Rand Paul, he pointed this out in a congressional hearing to Marco Rubio, who was trying to play this game. He's like, well, it was a policing act. It's like, come on, man. Anyway, so Americanism. I want to get back to the Americanism, what that is, because um, it seems like Massie embodies Americanism, whereas I would term what Trump is doing. It's Trumpism. It's a mishmash of neoconservatism, of how do you call it, like strongman style policy making, and some generally good policies. I mean, when you're talking about immigration, I don't think any. I mean, he's done great on that. He sealed the border. They're trying to get rid of illegals. I'm not sure. I know that I understand that some of the methods that they're using are considered cruel. I'm not for cruelty, but again, the whole immigration thing that was going to sink this country if we continue to allow that. He's done great on that. He's done great on energy. Got rid of all the green regulations, and he made moves to boost fossil fuel production. Great idea. He did culturally great on the whole anti DEI, the whole anti racism deal. He opposed the LGBTQ insanity. They got rid of like homosexuals and the trans, the mentally ill from the army. It's like, yeah, that makes sense. Those are good moves. Those are good moves. But he's also pursuing policies uh, on foreign policy and fiscal responsibility that are completely, and of course the Epstein thing. He has failed on those three fronts. And those three fronts, I mean, those two fronts, especially when you're talking about foreign policy and fiscal recklessness, that too poses a major threat to this country and could destroy us. So going back to Americanism, well, what is Americanism? Again, it's the ideology that state and federal governments should operate according to the prescriptions of the founders and within the parameters of the U.S. Constitution. And so one of the things that means is that no foreign military adventurism that is not justified. And so George Washington talked about this in his farewell address. John Q. Adams Quincy Adams made some comments about how we don't go abroad looking for monsters. Obviously, that's what we're doing right now in Iran. He's like, America doesn't do that. That is exactly what we're doing. Washington also said that we're going to try to live peaceably with everyone and do business with everyone who would do business with us without us meddling in their business and them meddling in ours. Okay, that's clearly not what's happening. We are in a state of imperialism, and that is contrary to the Americanist values and principles that the founding fathers, the framers, and I would say the first generations of leaders in this country were against. Everything kind of started changing in a major way in the 20th century. We started getting away from that. Another thing that Americanism means is fiscal responsibility. Now, there's no statutes, clauses in the Constitution that says that we can't be in debt. I'll give you that. But in the Federalist, number 51, Madison wrote, "If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on the government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." Now, that last part, that really, really pops out to me, because they're saying it's difficult to keep the government under control. But he says that's the goal. I would argue, and I would challenge anyone to challenge this, that $39 trillion in debt is a clear sign that the federal government is out of control. Absolutely out of control. Now you have even mainstream economists who are warning about the fact that this debt is unsustainable. This is not going to end well. This is out of our control. This is out of control. And Trump obviously has he's played a role in that. His one big beautiful bill is projected to raise the debt by like 3 trillion. Now, of course, they say that they're going to offset that with growth, and I hope that's true. But there's no sign that that's happening. It hasn't even begun to happen. There was no sign that he knew what he was doing when it came to fiscal responsibility in the first term. He was a big spender. We didn't offset any of the debt. It only continues to grow. So that's contrary to the principles of Americanism. Now, going back to this, to what I consider like the heart of Americanism, it's about the separation of powers, which is called federalism. It means that basically what the Constitution doesn't allow the government to do, it cannot do. Now, there is the 10th Amendment basically lays that out. And it says that any powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. And so the framers built a government of checks and balances, all sorts of checks. You always hear it's like, oh, so and so, like you hear this about Massie. He doesn't get anything done. Well, secondly, I mean, first of all, he does get a lot done. I would say I mean, the Epstein thing was a big, big deal. But this idea that they're always supposed to be getting something done in Congress is contrary, is antithetical to the ideas of how the government, the United States government, is supposed to work. They put in all these checks and balances to make it hard to pass bills, to spend money, to do all these things. And so this idea of federalism, this is 100%, it is 100% Americanist. So they divided the government, into the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branch, and then they even broke up the legislative branch. And so James Madison, the father of the Constitution, he warned in Federalist number 47 that if this isn't adhered to, if this dichotomy is not respected, it will lead to tyranny. He said in Federalist number 47 that the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So we're getting, it's not a good sign when one guy can basically order the world's strongest military to do whatever he wants it to. That's not a good sign. It is not how this system was designed. And I think there's a few reasons why there's still support of this. And this goes back to a warning by George Washington. Well, I think the main reason we are still seeing, two reasons, of course. First, we have a major problem of ignorance going on, and this was intentional. I'm not saying that people are naturally stupid. I'm saying they grew up in a world that was artificially designed to keep them ignorant of how the United States government was supposed to work, of what would benefit their lives. For the most part, everything that we've been told growing up, for the most part, has been false, and it has been the inverse of what would be beneficial to us. And so that's why, you have people fighting over federally funded healthcare. Well, that was never in the Constitution, and there was a reason for that, because that was supposed to be a state issue. Okay, the Department of Education. Why is it so important to have a Department of Education? Well, for them, it's because they're able to dumb down the kids and indoctrinate them. But again, that was never a duty, a responsibility of the federal government. You're talking about the EPA, the CDC. There's all these departments that have no constitutional permission to exist, and yet they exist. And the reason they still exist is because most people don't even realize that they shouldn't, that they're not allowed to under the US Constitution. So that's one major reason that Trump is still, has some support. Apparently he has a lot of support, I guess. I don't know how much support. It's hard to tell. We know that some of it has fallen off and whatnot, and rightly so, but he still has a lot. And I've seen some of the comments that people make, when we write something about Thomas Massie or whatever, they're like, well, he never gets anything done. He doesn't vote with the party. And I'm like, well, that's a clear indicator that you've kind of been fooled into believing that a legislator is supposed to be something that he's not. A legislator doesn't swear an oath to the GOP. He doesn't swear an oath to the Democratic Party. He doesn't swear an oath to the President of the United States. He swears allegiance to the U.S. Constitution. And people need to understand that, because apparently they don't. When you attack someone because he doesn't get along with the party, he doesn't play ball, what you're attacking is what you're advocating is something that George Washington actually warned about. He warned about parties because he knew it would lead to this. He knew it would lead to this. It leads to this tribalism that bodes well for the people in charge. And tribalism makes people ignorant. It also directs them to focus on party affiliation or party and personalities over principles. That's what tribalism does. Let me read you some quotes from George Washington's farewell address, where he talks about the dangers of parties, of allegiance to party over principle. He says, however, political parties or combinations may now and then answer popular ends. They are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. So he's saying that parties, again, they benefit the ambitious, the unprincipled, the people who are looking to get more power for themselves. And that's what the government has done. It has usurped an enormous amount of power by delegating so much to the federal government. What you do is you take it away from the states, and you take those responsibility away from the states and from local. So now it's harder for us as the people to exercise control over policies, because the higher up, the further away it gets from us, the harder it is to have influence on it. And so when they put education under the umbrella of the government, when they put healthcare under the umbrella of the government, and when they usurp the power of the people to decide when their country will go to war and when not, by putting all that in the hands of the United States president, we have given power over to, like Washington says, unprincipled men, cunning, ambitious, who want to subvert power away from us, from the people. Here's another one from George Washington. He says, the alternate domination of one faction over another, one party over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissensions, we're seeing that whole bickering between parties, which is different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of people to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual who, and sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able to more fortunate than his competitors, turns his disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. That kind of sounds like what we're experiencing now. So I want to finish off with this, because I don't want to go on for too long, but here we are. We're in this interesting time, and it's 12 years, I think, 10 or 11 years since Trump came down the escalator. There was a lot of hope, and there was a lot of support. And then in 2025, things started to change. He kind of reverted back to the neocon, to embracing a lot of the neocon positions that that he seemed to have railed against, especially when it comes to intervention. I mean, when he was talking about the Iraq War, that was like one of his strongest points. He's like, we should have never been there, or whatever. And now he's doing exactly that. But now we also have this other rising star. He seems to be, I went to an event on Saturday, his HQ headquarters, his campaign headquarters launch. And I felt a similar type of excitement there. Obviously, the crowd wasn't as big. It couldn't even fit that much of a crowd. But it was exciting. There's a lot of excitement that centers around someone who is principled, someone who is brave, someone who stands up for the right things. And I think in that sense, Thomas Massie is different from Trump, because he always had questionable character. You had the Access Hollywood video come out where he's talking about grabbing women by their crotches and whatnot. He said things that were crude and whatever. And we all knew that all the time. We knew that was the case. We overlooked it for various reasons. But then now he's not, I mean, he's still doing all that kind of, but he's not even delivering on his promises. So I think this is a good question. Are we now watching the next reiteration, the next phase of what I hope is a mass movement of people from the Trumpist MAGA ideals to the Americanism, funneling into um, real Make America Great, real America First, which is Americanist. Trump always failed short of a number of those things, but there was always this hope that we would come around. There was a lot of reasons to be hopeful. His attacks on supranational organizations that have always been good. He pulled out from a number of them. We really were proud of that. We're happy about that and whatnot. But now we need to take it to the next level. So are we there? Are we watching the next phase of the great American comeback? Is that what's happening here? Or is this the turbulence before everything collapses? I don't know. I don't know, but it is exciting times. And what uh, what always consoles me is that I know how everything ends. You know, I'm a true Bible believing Christian. I've had some experiences, some supernatural experiences that basically have entrenched, have solidified my faith beyond, and nothing can take that away. And so what I'm doing, I'm here. I am who I am. I'm a reporter. I'm a commentator. I research. I enjoy watching what's happening as God's play on earth plays out, and I'm looking forward to the next phase of this saga.